We are now in the boundary zone to the next ice age, and have been for 20 years already. In this zone, ever greater climate events are the norm. Here, traditional yardsticks no longer apply to predict the future, because we live in a different landscape now that is dominated by the sun getting rapidly weaker. The solar wind, that is an indicator of the strength of the sun, is diminishing at a rate of 30% per decade and will reach zero pressure in the 2030s. That's the end of the first phase of the collapse process. After that, it gets worse. The solar wind is comparable to steam being boiled off from a heated kettle. Water cannot be heated to more than 100 degrees at sea level pressure. When more heat is applied, the excess heat converts water into steam. When the heat input diminishes, the steam eventually stops flowing. After that, the water begins to cool. We know from this that for as long as the kettle emits steam, the water in the kettle is 100 degrees hot, because it cannot get any hotter unless the pressure in the kettle is increased. The solar dynamics are similar. When solar wind is emitted by the sun, there is more than enough plasma pressure surrounding it to keep its plasma fusion fully in operation. This means that for as long as the solar wind is emitted, there is enough density in the system for the sun's surface temperature to be maintained near the current temperature of 5,800 degrees. This happens all the way through the first phase of the weakening of the solar system. The only effect on the Earth that we see of the progressive weakening is that larger volumes of solar cosmic ray flux impact our atmosphere, which affects the cloud-forming process. When the solar system weakens, the plasma sphere around the sun weakens likewise. This means that a larger volume of solar cosmic ray flux can penetrate this barrier. The changing volume results in changing climate conditions on Earth. The cosmic rays affect the Earth's climate enormously. Cosmic rays ionize the atmosphere, which boosts the cloud-forming process and the condensation into rain. The effects of cosmic ray increases include flooding, droughts, colder climates, and reduced greenhouse moderation. All of these effects increase throughout the first phase towards 2030. While the sun's surface temperature will remain the same throughout this period. It needs to be noted here that most of the cosmic ray flux that impacts the Earth flows from the sun. This fact is rarely recognized. In comparison, the galactic portion is relatively small, though it is deemed to be the only source for cosmic ray flux. The seeming paradox has been somewhat resolved experimentally with measured evidence. The researcher Simon Schnorr had conducted a series of identical chemical reaction experiments, continuously repeated for several days. He noted that each time the results were different. In one case, the reactivity spiked tremendously, repeated in 24-hour intervals according to the rotation of the Earth, with the repeated spikes becoming smaller according to the rotation of the Sun, as if a coronal hole had emitted strong cosmic ray flux, which subsequently turned away from its orientation towards the Earth by the rotation of the Sun. The experiment proves that our Sun is capable of extremely large cosmic ray-type emissions. It is generally assumed that all cosmic ray flux is galactic in origin, so that the fluctuations that have been measured on Earth are assumed to be caused by the heliosphere that surrounds the solar system fluctuating in density. The fluctuating density of the heliosphere is deemed to alter the volume of cosmic ray flux that penetrates it. Simon Schnoll's experiment disproves this assumption. The measured fluctuations in his experiment vastly supersedes the heliosphere's measured attenuation. When NASA's Voyager 1 spacecraft penetrated the heliosphere in 2012, it measured a mere 35% increase in the number of cosmic ray particles encountered. That's the maximum increase that we could encounter if the heliosphere would vanish completely, should this be possible. In comparison with the maximum attenuation that the heliosphere affords, large fluctuations of cosmic ray flux occur at every solar cycle. Fluctuations in the range of up to 30% have been measured. If we can measure such large fluctuations between the solar cycles, with the heliosphere being unaffected by the solar cycles, we have positive proof on hand that the cosmic ray flux that affects our climate as dramatically as it does originate from the Sun and from nowhere else. It has been demonstrated in laboratory experiments, with the cloud experiment at the CERN laboratory in Europe. Cosmic ray interaction dramatically increases cloud nucleation. When artificial cosmic rays were injected into a test chamber as the final step of the experiment, the measured water nucleation went straight up and off the chart. Thus, the experiment proves in principle that the diminishing solar activity in the boundary zone is the climate master on Earth via its cosmic ray effects on cloudiness. Cloudiness affects everything: droughts, flooding, global cooling, even temperature extremes. We will see ever more of these effects resulting from diminishing solar activity and increased cosmic ray flux until the solar wind stops and the Sun begins to cool, for an additionally challenging effect. After the solar wind stops, the diminishing Sun begins to cool down to lower surface temperatures. That's the start of Phase 2. Phase 2 ends when the primer fields collapse. When the heat is turned down low after a kettle stops boiling, the water cools down. so does the sun. All the way through phase 2, the sun will get colder, with the corresponding effects on Earth. The effects can be enormous, such as that the snow no longer melts in the climate-volatile regions. Whatever natural agriculture might still be in operation at the start of phase 2 will likely cease during the course of phase 2 unfolding, which may be short in duration. Phase 3 begins when the solar system has diminished to the point that the primal fields can no longer form and cease to focus plasma onto the sun. At this point, the sun begins to hibernate, and the next ice age erupts on Earth that transforms the world into an ice planet that has never been experienced before in known history, and may not actually be imaginable. And yes, we do have measurements available of the phase 2 to phase 3 transition that puts the sun into hibernation. The measurements exist in the form of extremely high beryllium ratios that extend all the way through phase 3, the 90,000-year glaciation phase, the ice planet phase. Only the hibernating sun that is no longer surrounded by a dense mantle of plasma can produce these high volume of solar cosmic ray flux that generate the high ratios of beryllium-10 that have been measured. Phase 3 is the phase of the hibernating sun, a 70% weaker sun, and a world with 80% less precipitation. While we can prepare for this type of landscape by building us a new world with technological infrastructures for human living and for agriculture, of types that can operate efficiently under ice age conditions by placing agriculture and cities afloat onto the equatorial seas. We won't get anything built if we don't start. In this case, it becomes irrelevant to know how soon phase 3 will start, because then very few people will be still alive when the ice age begins. The bottom line is that we need the Plan B option implemented long before phase 3 starts. We cannot respond in a reactive mode any longer, because it takes all the time we've got to create the floating agriculture that is able to nourish billions of people and build the thousands of new floating cities attached to surface the agriculture. That's our Plan B, and we need it coming online early in the boundary zone, before agriculture is beginning to collapse. If humanity follows the Plan B path, that its science defines as extremely imperative, then humanity will write itself a ticket to continue to live and prosper. And if not, this option is not worth contemplating. The Plan A option is to do nothing. Then people will die. Plan B needs to be started in the present, while we still have a chance to build us out of the already beginning climate collapse crisis. The time we have remaining is short, and is presently being wasted by society doing nothing, and with no intention for stirring its stumps, even while agriculture as we know it is already collapsing to some degree in many parts of the world. Food shortages are on the horizon. The earth is getting colder year after year. The growing seasons are shrinking and droughts are increasing. Ultimately, when agriculture collapses under the climate collapse, entire nations in the volatile regions, such as Canada, Russia, and the EU nations, will simply cease to exist, unless the new world is created in which agriculture is technologically protected under the Plan B created alternative. The last meaningful historic climate recovery by real solar global warming had begun in the early 1700s. It had peaked in the 1990s and then began to reverse. Small as the last global warming pulse was, it gave us 300 years of the amazing global warming that was exclusively caused by the sun, solidly proved in hard measurements. Remember this warm period fondly, when the sun was ramped up. It may be the reason why we all exist. It broke the little ice age and saved us potentially from the big ice age. But the warming is now fading. We are on the fading slope. Nothing will bring it back. Man-made global warming is not physically possible because we cannot affect the sun. It would be wonderful if we had the capability to master the sun, which masters the climate on Earth. Carbon gases in the air are not a significant climate factor, even as greenhouse gases. They pale in comparison with water vapor that causes nearly all of the greenhouse effect. Just compare the absorption coefficients. That of water vapor is up to 20 times greater than that of CO2. Then consider further that water vapor is up to 100 times more abundant in the atmosphere. In addition, water vapor is effective across a vastly wider band of the energy spectrum. Then add to the comparison the further absorption of solar energy by oxygen and by the Rayleigh scattering effect, which are both effective at a high-energy part of the light spectrum. And it becomes self-evident that CO2 contributes so little to the greenhouse effect of the Earth that it isn't worth the mention. In comparison, the CO2 effect is no bigger than a cat standing beside the World Trade Towers in New York, which some people may still remember. Now assume that a cat could be overnourished to become the size of a horse. It still would be too minuscule to be noticed on this wider scene. It would be wonderful if man-made global warming was possible, in order that we would develop this power to block the Ice Age consequences. While we don't have that capability to stop the Ice Ages, we do have the power to avoid the consequences. We have the power to create a man-made new world that the Ice Age consequences cannot affect. The man-made global warming doctrine doesn't even pretend to go that far as to block the near ice age. Instead, it effectively hides it and replaces it with apocalyptic scaring. The doctrine's objective is to block the recognition of the near ice age, and to likewise block the recognition of the solar cause of the global warming that had saved the world in the 1700s, while the doctrine promises doom without a recourse. And still the treachery goes deeper than merely scaring society into submission. For this deeper effect, since man-made global warming isn't actually happening, the doctrine has been renamed to man-made climate change, so that it can mean anything that one dares to apply to it. The result is similar in effect to that of the term Illuminati, the light of the star that fell from heaven and became Satan, which became attached to a range of secret underground organizations, mostly without an identifiable face, but of reputed fierce power and wide influence, so that resistance is deemed futile. The man-made global warming effect is similarly said to be dangerous and ultimately without a possible solution. When the human mind is confronted with an existential challenge without an identified face, like that of man-made climate change that can mean anything, with a challenge attached without hope, a challenge for which no solution is deemed possible except the self-termination of humanity, then the mind reverts backwards to a lower level of thinking, to a more infantile thinking, which becomes a form of self-defense. This mental regression is the intention of nearly all psychological warfare games. Against the imposed reduced mentality background, the most devastating impositions can be forced on society. The impositions are forced, politically with regulations, economically with carbon taxes, physically with deindustrialization, and socially with the mass burning of food under the biofuels project that society willingly participates in at the gas pump. In a world that has 1 billion people living in chronic starvation, the mass burning of food at a rate that would normally nourish 400 million people is likely killing upwards to 100 million people a year with starvation. The effect is, and this is intended, that the man-made climate change doctrine effectively robs society of its humanity by staging it into a fight against itself, unwittingly, as in the ancient wars of empire against humanity that are still ongoing in some form. The Greek playwright Aeschylus dealt with the Illuminati-type issues or man-made climate change-type issues already as far back as 2,400 years ago. He addressed the concepts that are deliberate mind killers in his trilogy, Prometheus Bound. His solution to the issues was to raise his audience to a higher level of self-perception with the perception of the truth. For us, the equivalent scientific recognition is that man-made climate change is physically impossible. This obvious fact becomes apparent when the Illuminati devil's voices are banished from the mind, whereby the simple truth becomes apparent without fail. The strategic defense of humanity requires that humanity raise itself above the false doctrines to higher levels of scientific perception, even its self-perception, and a recognition of its power. Then, under the freedom of the truth, the Plan B option will be pursued, and humanity will have a future. However, the truth poses a big challenge for scientific recognition because the diminishing greenhouse effect and its reduced climate moderation enable hotter temperature extremes in the summer that are mistakenly accepted as proof for man-made global warming climate change, while the opposite is the case. The defense of humanity against the false notions that are mistakenly accepted as real is possible with a more expanded scientific understanding of the astrophysical principles and of the truth of their effects. Tragically, this understanding is still lacking, even in the science community, that almost universally remains trapped by the mind-choking dictates of the science Illuminati, so that nothing gets built. For decades in the past, more than 50,000 protest signatures had been uttered by the science community worldwide in opposition of the man-made global warming doctrine, while the detailed arguments of their opposition remained limited to within the mystic framework established by the science Illuminati. The protest movement should have built on the measured fact that the ever-changing sun is the climate driver on Earth. Just imagine the boundless freedom that this simple science recognition, built on measured fact, would have brought to humanity, and could bring to it even now. It would end carbon taxes, reverse the vilification of humanity, cancel the biofuels murdering by food burning, and it would open the mind to the recognition of the near ice age on the horizon and inspire the building of a new world for it, for our future survival on an Earth that is becoming largely an ice planet from the 2050s onward, potentially. With the mind becoming free to accept the truth, the recognition would dawn that the greenhouse effect of our atmosphere is diminishing instead of increasing. The most important service that the greenhouse effect of the Earth's atmosphere provides is to moderate climate fluctuations. Without the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere, we would encounter the same temperature fluctuations as we see on the Moon, which has no atmosphere. The nights would drop to minus 170 degrees Celsius, and the days to be hotter than boiling water at 117 degrees. The moderating effect of the greenhouse narrows these extremes to a nicely livable climate. However, since up to 90% of the greenhouse effect is contributed by water vapor in the atmosphere, a small reduction of the water vapor density, resulting in greenhouse effects, can have large consequences. And that's what we are beginning to experience ever more now, as the result of the increasing cosmic reflux that flows from our weakening sun. The currently increasing solar cosmic reflux, which increases the cloud-forming intensity and the rain out of the clouds, primarily over the oceans, is diminishing the greenhouse effect. It is destructive of it. The increased water nucleation into clouds takes more water vapor out of the atmosphere than evaporation can replenish. The thereby reduced water vapor density reduces the greenhouse effect. As the result of the reduced water vapor density and reduced greenhouse moderation, we are experiencing increasingly larger climate fluctuations. We experience more sweltering hot summer days, and with them larger droughts and ever more forest fires, which are both amplified by the sweltering heat, while winters become colder and snowier in many parts of the world. These effects are already being felt. They are real and they are increasing. In Australia, for example, which is the world's fourth largest wheat exporter, wheat harvests fell by 40% in the 2017-18 season because of drought and too much heat, as the result of the weakening sun and its increasing cosmic reflux that lowers the greenhouse effect. This year, Australian farmers are planting their wheat in the driest soils in years and pray for rain. So far, Western Australia has received just 27% of its average rainfall over March and April, with soil moisture in the eastern regions being at a 5-year low. We should see these types of effects as warning bells ringing, as a warning to the world of how the boundary zone to the near ice age is unfolding. In the previous comparison, the total greenhouse effect is represented by the World Trade Towers compared to a cat representing the CO2 contribution, while the overfeeding of the cat to become a horse, if this was possible, would have no significant effect on the total scene. The removal of a dozen floors from the towers would have a major effect. The shrinking of the buildings would represent the removal of water vapor from the atmosphere by increased solar cosmic reflux ionization. That's in principle how the sun affects our greenhouse as a big variable factor. The result of the shrinking greenhouse effect, as it was felt in Australia, will be felt worldwide in ever larger measures over the next 15 years, because of the ever-increasing solar cosmic reflux that affects our atmosphere, resulting from the weakening sun. Now consider that during glaciation conditions, precipitation diminishes by 80% because a colder sun evaporates less water. This means that our greenhouse effect might be up to 80% weaker. That's like taking 80 stories of the buildings, which leaves us only a very small greenhouse remaining. The reduced greenhouse would compensate somewhat for the colder sun, but it would make the nights tremendously colder. These effects are sure to happen, while no historic measurements for them exist. They will affect our living and our agriculture in large measures, if these are not technologically protected. While the Ice Age effects cannot be avoided, it is possible to create technological solutions for the consequences of the effects. That's where Plan B begins. Here is where the diminishing greenhouse effect may come to our aid, as the increasing consequences might yet inspire society's willingness to face the Ice Age challenge and respond to it. We live in the boundary time zone leading up to the next Ice Age glaciation cycle that potentially begins in the 2050s. None of the climate transformations that we encounter in the boundary zone are man-made, nor can they be prevented. But we can bring our living into line with the unfolding dynamics by building us a new world. We have the power to do this technologically. However, where are the movements in this direction? Who stands in the hustings fighting for a response? Where is the march of the dollars? The hustings are empty. The dollars are hoarded out of reach. The entire scene of society protecting its future is presently a dead scene. The entire climate scene that determines our collective future is wrapped up in dreams, which are mostly dreams of denial of the scientifically obvious. For example, the last global warming pulse that occurred in the 1700s that had saved the world from the Little Ice Age, and possibly from the big one too at the time, was the most recent of the big warming pulses of the last 3,500 years. These pulses are the result of a diminishing internal resonance feature within the solar system. By being resonance pulses, the climate warming pulses are of short duration, and since we are presently near the end of the current one, its lingering effect is fast vanishing. This means that we are nearing the conjunction of two major plasma structures, which have been both simultaneously diminishing. The warming pulse is ending, which takes us all the way down to the underlying background, which has been diminishing likewise. The combination of the two dynamics adds up to a free-fall collapse that is now in progress towards the inevitable glacial climate in the 2050s. In the unfolding boundary zone, we will experience ever more fringe effects along the way, of which increased drought and reduced greenhouse effects are a part of, that are already being experienced. And we will experience these fringe effects with ever-increasing severity. With the last global warming pulse now fast ending, everything is happening correspondingly, increasingly fast, with changes erupting in ever smaller time frames. The fast progression puts the onus on us for fast action responses in implementing a Plan B option for the strategic defense of humanity, which should be on the global agenda already and be driven by the scientific imperative to protect our food supply. When the global climate is collapsing under the diminishing sun, our agriculture, that depends on specific climate conditions, will be collapsing likewise. Our response must be to build us a new world with technological infrastructures that the collapsing climate cannot touch. If this requires that the new world be placed afloat across the equatorial seas, then this must be our development plan to assure our future existence. We are in this type of boundary zone where nothing less will do, where the current plan A, to do nothing, adds up to suicide. How soon humanity will get to the point where it should be already depends on the individual efforts in society to get there. In this respect, too, we live in a type of boundary zone. This one is of a different type that is not determined by time and by cosmic dynamics, but is determined by the dynamics of our humanity, where time is not an absolute factor, where instead time simply means space for repentance. Most people consider the wonderful warm climate that we had enjoyed in the last 100 years, going into the year 2000, to be the normal climate on Earth that will never change. In reality, this idyllic climate is an anomaly that is fast fading. Science makes this rather plain. It was a fortunate anomaly that had rescued us from the Little Ice Age in the 1600s and from the drought conditions that are known to have occurred in this time frame under the extremely weak sun. The growing conditions were so poor at that time that starvation had become the norm and cannibalism is said to have occurred. Now we are on the fast track of slipping back to the low-density plasma background that had existed during the Little Ice Age, which has continued its diminishing. The current plasma density background is way below what it had been during the Little Ice Age. This means that we are on the path towards experiencing and dropping below the type of cold climate that the solar global warming anomaly had saved us from. Those harsh historic climate conditions are already beginning to shine through. We simply won't survive in this unfolding climate collapse that the ever-declining normal base has in store for us during the boundary zone. The Plan B is critical for our 7 billion world population, but it is not optional. It is the human thing to pursue. Plan B is the human thing to pursue because to deny us this option is a form of self-denial. That's why to fail promises catastrophic consequences. Fortunately, we won't go this route of deadly self-denial. Self-denial is not the norm for humanity. We can step away from self-denial. Just consider what had enabled the phenomenal world population growth in the last 300 years from very low population levels. This population gain didn't just happen, nor was it the result of improved breeding habits in society. The increase was created as the product of humanity's science and technologies in conjunction with the rapidly improving climate. The big population increase began with the general dawn of science and technologies, and later with industrialization. And it also coincided with the 300 years of sun-cast global warming that broke us out of the Little Ice Age. The improved climate created ideal growing conditions that the technological agriculture had been able to build on. Without these two factors, the population level would have remained as flat as it had been before. Now, with the climate collapse unfolding like a falling stone, the only factor that we have in our hands, which we can control, is our science and technology. The general recognition of them needs to be mobilized if we hope to win the war, to compensate for the collapsing climate, especially in agriculture. And this can be accomplished. We have it in our power to create climate-independent agriculture. It is not a human thing to exploit the natural world. It is the human thing to step above the natural world and raise it up to higher forms of power. Building protected floating agriculture placed afloat across the equatorial seas, with new cities attached to them, and with new industries and universities to optimize growing conditions, would be an example of humanity stepping up to greater forms of productive power. A 50-fold increase in produced yield throughout the agricultural system may be within reach. It would be an example of advanced humanist development unfolding our potential. Of course, the task on this scale is so vast in scope that no nation can carry the torch alone. All nations must carry the torch together and benefit together. On the Plan B productive path, we will find that the world's nuclear weapons arsenals will simply be recycled and be burned up as nuclear energy fuels. The Ice Age challenge can accomplish this step with ease, which nothing else has so far been able to accomplish. I think it is safe to say that the total eradication of nuclear weapons will happen in the not-so-distant future. Science will assure this. It has the power to impel politics. When a country like China loses a portion of its food crops to drought or colder climates, the politics will become adjusted to enable Plan B options that total nuclear disarmament is an inherent part of. Canada, Europe, and Russia will likely be in the critical climate position sooner than China and take the lead on this. Once the process is moving, the lid is blown off false paradigms that keep humanity divided. When critical physical imperatives begin to force the issues, things will begin to move and move ever more rapidly.